Hello everyone, welcome to the first video of DevOps Expert series. In this video, I'm going to lay the groundwork for a clear understanding of what a DevOps engineer is and what sort of task that he or she performs on a day-to-day basis. Once we are clear about what exactly this role entails, I'm going to share with you a set of tools that we use as a DevOps engineer and try to list them in order. From my next video, we'll explore each of those tools individually and I'll explain to you exactly where we'll utilize those tools in our workflow. After watching this series, you'll have a good grasp on when and where to use these tools. And also, you'll confidently showcase your skills with an end-to-end complete project that will make use of all the tool we'll learn. But my main goal in this video is just to get you excited knowing about DevOps and removing any doubts and fear that you might have about this position. From my own experience, DevOps engineers are like the jack of all trades. Now, without any further ado, let us get into work. So there are lots of different definition of DevOps online, which you can look into. But I like to start with one analogous example, which I think really fits well with the DevOps engineering role. So let me take an example of a small restaurant. Let's say this is a small family-owned restaurant. Let's give it a name R1, and it has uh, a cook, maybe the father is a cook, and there is a busboy. Let's say the busboy is the son, and there is a server. Maybe server is the mom, and there are customers. So let us try to understand the workflow of this particular small family-owned restaurant. So usually what happens is when a customer comes in, so there is an order placement. So that's the first step that happens. Once the order is placed, once the order is placed, the food is prepared. So the father cooks the food. Uh, he makes sure the food is prepared as per the requirement of the customer. After this prep phase, there is a phase of making sure the food is made well. So it's tasted properly. So make sure the customer's requirements are fulfilled. After that, the next step would be to place the food in the right kind of utensil, maybe depending on what kind of food is being served, the right kind of utensil is being used to serve that food. And after that food is placed on a plate, the next step is the proper delivery of the food. Delivery. So the mom or the server makes sure that the food is delivered correctly to the customer. And for sure, after the food is tasted, the customer maybe gives some sort of feedback, saying if the food is really good, bad, or maybe something could be improved. So, in this very crude workflow, I actually have something that is very similar to what we call is a software development lifecycle process, which is very similar to the same process that is used in this small family-owned restaurant. So let me translate this information into something that is used in a product-based or a service-based company. So the order is equivalent to requirement gathering phase. So it's a requirement gathering phase where the client comes in and then they tell you, hey, this is the requirement that we have for a certain product or certain service. If you are building an application, fulfill that for us. And after this requirement building, requirement gathering phase, there comes the next phase, which is the coding phase, where mostly the developers or the data engineers work together to come up with a solution to fulfill that particular requirement. And then after that, the next step would be the testing phase. So this is performed by the QA, um, or any team that makes sure that the code has no bug and it's working as per the requirement of the client. And then the delivery part would be something equivalent to deployment in a company. So once the product is ready, we deploy it to the test environment, make sure everything is looking good, and if everything passes well, then we deploy the same code to the production environment. So this is also called merging your code to the prod or deployment process. And then finally, your customer or your client get those code application, and then they will give you the feedback of what might be missing, or what are the good features. So this process is very important because first of all, number one, this is an iterative process. It doesn't complete at one cycle. There are multiple cycles and there are a lot of feature releases that will happen based on what could be improved and what things we could work on. And the other advantage of working in this particular life cycle is there is a rapid delivery of the product. So when we see this process, where does exactly DevOps engineer work in this workflow? So from my experience, what I can tell you is DevOps engineer is mostly present in the entire workflow. His role will change for sure, like his task will change, and he has like different level of work in this particular workflow, but he is present in most of the tasks. So now, once we understand the software development life cycle, so now let me go ahead, put this same concept and explain you what tools could be used to perform this process. So let us start with like the planning or the requirement gathering phase. So this is the first part in any software development lifecycle. And the key tool, let me put the tools here. So in the planning phase, the most important tools, and let me put DevOps engineer here. So his role in this planning phase is active, and the tool that he will use is communication. A good communication is very important in this phase of the software development lifecycle because there will be lots of meetings. The requirement will be handed out to the team. So it's up to the DevOps engineer to make sure that all the requirements are understood properly and decide what kind of workflow or what kind of pipeline that he will use to perform his task. So a good communication with the stakeholder and with the team member is essential during this process. Second, after planning comes the coding phase. For this coding phase, the primary stakeholder would be a developer or a data engineer. So these two people will have a primary responsibility in this coding phase. But how would a DevOps engineer be helpful, or what kind of tool he can use? So one of the primary tool he will utilize for this process is a version control tool like Git and GitHub, which should be our next video. So this is where whenever a developer or a data engineer writes their code, they will have to push their code to a certain central repository. This is where the use of version control comes in. and this is managed by a DevOps engineer. So he makes sure all the code are placed in a certain central repository where from where he can use that code and deploy it later down the road. Then the third phase begins with testing. And the primary stakeholder would be a quality analyst, QA. But how would a DevOps engineer be helpful in this position? So there are multiple ways a DevOps engineer can help in this position. For example, he can automate this process of coding to testing using different tools. Like for example, if you're using AWS as your cloud provider, you can use compute services like Lambda, or if you are using Jenkins, you can use Jenkins pipeline to build and automate certain processes. So this workflow, the testing part could be fully automated, utilizing the script given to you by the QA to test out the bugs in the code that the developers provide. So a testing phase, different type of tools could be used. So this is number one, this is number two, this is number three. And then finally comes the build plus deployment phase. This is where the true talent of a DevOps engineer will shine. So there are different type of tools that could be used in this step. So for this, we will have many different tools that we'll learn for this process. So let's say if your application is being deployed in a microservices architecture, and if you are utilizing again AWS as your cloud provider, there are different containerization service that the AWS provides, like for example elastic container services, Kubernetes, Docker. So you can utilize any of those tools. Or if it's not a container based deployment, then obviously you can use Jenkins for the build and deployment. If it's your Java based project or if it's any other project, the build and deployment could be utilized using Jenkins, which is a very helpful tool that I use very often at my work as well. But also I make use of these containerized services as well. And this is where we will have a lot of discussion in the near future, because there are two parts to it. First of all, this build and deployment has to be created. So all of these processes has to be created using infrastructure as a code. So we'll make use of different tools like Terraform to build this infrastructure. And I'll explain to you later in the next videos about what infrastructure as code is. So we'll use Terraform or CloudFormation to set up this infrastructure, this microservices infrastructure. And then we'll also make use of configuration management tools, CM tools, like Ansible, to make sure that all of the tools that we create using this infrastructure as code has the correct configuration, has everything installed properly. So this portion will make use of a lot of different tools and technology, and this is one of the very vital part uh, for a DevOps engineer. And I'll explain the whole process to you in the upcoming videos. And then the fifth step would be the constant monitoring. So you'll do all of these tasks, but at the end you'll make sure that all of your infrastructure and all of your deployment process are running well. So there are different tools again for monitoring that you can use. Again, if you are using AWS, you'll be utilizing AWS Cloud Logs or AWS Cloud Trail, or you'll also make use of tools like Prometheus, Grafana to monitor some of your tools. So on top of all of this, so these processes happen in the cloud. So the primary cloud platform that I will be working on in these videos will be AWS. So AWS would be the cloud provider that we'll be using to deploy all of our code, because we'll be running our virtual machines in the cloud where we'll install all of the necessary software and then deploy and build our code. So AWS will be the major cloud provider that we'll be using throughout this session. Now with this explanation, let me get into the last agenda for our discussion today. So as a DevOps engineer, how do I add value to my team? So for to answer that question, I'd have to first explain you the model that we follow at our workplace. Like most of the companies these days, we follow this agile model. So in this agile model, each of our tasks is considered as a story point, which has to be so that story point could be 1, 2, 5, depending on like how big your task is, and this story has to be completed within a sprint. So sprint is a set of time, usually it's 15 business days for my team, where we have to complete this task. So what does this tells me? So this tells me that there should be a process which where there needs to be a deployment every 15 days, and which is quite often. So for that, I need a very robust process to make sure that this deployment happens properly and there is no failure. So number one, I can build a system that is very robust and that helps in the rapid delivery of my product. So that helps in the rapid delivery of my product. So I have set up this delivery using Jenkins pipeline, using Jenkins, and using Kubernetes to deploy my Docker containers. So these are some of the things that I do, number one. Number two, I also need to set up my infrastructure in such a way that it can scale up and down quickly as per the requirement. Like for example, there are certain applications that need to scale up if the user number goes up. So for that, I work with infrastructure as a code to make sure that my application can scale up and down in a fly. So that's the second way I'm helping my team. And number three, apart from the deployment process, I'm also making sure that some of the repetitive tasks that happen in my team, like for example, with the QA task or some of the data loading process, I will automate those process using a simple Python script, which again I will show you in the upcoming uh, videos. So using Python Lambda, I'll automate some of the simple repetitive tasks. Number three. And number four, since I'm working from all the way from planning to deployment with different teams, I make sure that the is collaboration is wonderful, so that I have a constant communication with my developer, I have a constant communication with my QA, I have a constant communication with the client. So that way I make sure that there is a good collaboration so that everything is deployed on time, and if there is any confusion, everyone works together to fix and resolve that issue. So I make sure there is a good collaboration in my team. So due to all of these factors, what ends up happening is eventually the product or the service that my team provide is a really high quality reliable product because of all of these steps. And not to forget the sixth process, which is the monitoring part. So I make sure all of my application and all of my processes are running perfectly fine. So I make sure there is no failure in the production environment, and if there is any failure, I make sure to fix it immediately so that all the operation task is running perfectly well and healthy. So imagine, like, I already have six tasks, and these are all big tasks that have so many smaller tasks in between. So I feel like this is a very important work for any team or any company. So I'd like to say that the task that a DevOps engineer performs in a team is very crucial to the team, and we really add value to the team that we work for. And that really makes me feel very proud about what I do. So for our next session, we'll be starting off with version control. So the process that we'll follow is we will follow with version control, and once we have a repository for our code, what we can do is we can pull those code, build those, deploy those, and monitor those code. So this is the workflow that I'm trying to follow. So for the next session, this first part where I'll teach you about some basic Git command. I'll teach you how to install Git and GitHub on your desktop, spin up a virtual machine, install GitHub, and run some um, uh, basic Git commands, and also give you idea on some basic Linux command which are helpful uh, for a DevOps engineer. So this should be our first task before we do any build deployment or monitoring. So this is our agenda for next week. So thank you everyone who has been following me up to this point. Um, I will see you for the next session. And if you have any questions, any comment, please feel free um, to comment or message me. I'll try to reply you back as soon as possible. Uh, so see you again next week. Thank you.